here and taking the time amongst such, oh, it's right, perfect, stiff competition to be here. So I will take about 15-20 minutes to just introduce the book to you, tell you a little bit about it, and then that's it. I'll leave it to you. So my name is Gautam Bhan. I'm a urbanist, an urban sociologist, and a planner by training. And I teach at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements across the road here in Sadashiv. And I want to say first that I'm speaking on behalf of a collective of authors. There are four authors to this book. Michael Keith heads anthropology at the University of Oxford. Sue Parnell is senior professor at the University of Bristol. Edgar Peterser is the founding director of the African Centre for Cities at the University of Cape Town. And the person whose CV really does not belong with the rest of the three is me, who is here in Bangalore. And I say this also because one of the arguments we make in the book is about the need for collective thinking, and particularly the need for collective thinking about cities. And academics are not good at collective thinking. We are trained to be individual thought experiments. We are told very much that theory comes from individual acts of brilliance. And it's something that I was thankfully never taught by my teachers, and something I have never believed to be true. So let me tell you a story of one of the stories that brought us to this book. In 2020, when the first lockdowns were happening in COVID, one of the images that all of you will remember is a set of thousands and thousands of our fellow citizens walking on highways, leaving our cities, going quote unquote home, even though many of them were leaving cities where they had lived longer than I had been alive, where their children were born. I remember staring at a particular photograph of the highway and just thinking, why? Why would you risk your life in one of the world's harshest lockdowns? Risk death from the virus, risk hunger, risk police brutality. Because remember, the police was enforced with tasking that lockdown. And they were leaving from my home city, Delhi, where I'm based. The chief minister of my city was on the mic in press conferences begging people not to stay, saying there will be no hunger in Delhi. We will feed you, we will vaccinate you, don't go. And yet they kept walking. And one of the questions we had was why? When newspaper cameras caught up with those migrants on highways, they said, why are you doing this? And the migrants were completely surprised by the question. They said this is a time when everyone is trying to avoid death by an epidemic. And the single answer I remember was an NDTV, where this worker must have been in his mid-30s. He had a single bag on his back. For all his years in the city, he left with a single bag on his back. And he said, I am trying not to die. And I kept thinking, what does it mean for workers to tell us that they don't trust our cities at a time when our city should have cared for them the most? But what's most important was when the Stranded Workers Action Network, a set of researchers, said, tell us what you're most afraid of. The answer was not health, it was not hunger, it was not work. The answer was rent. They said, we can't manage the rent. We're not worried about food. We're not worried about the vaccine. We are not worried. We cannot manage rent. And somewhere the academic in me at that point woke up and said, we're asking the wrong question. We're solving the wrong problem. The chief minister, with all his good intent, is making the wrong reassurance. Okay? 6 months later, the chief minister did in fact say, waive the rent, stop the rent. He issued a moratorium on rent for 3 months. The thing in India is, how do you enforce a moratorium on rent? 88% of residential properties in India have no written rent agreement, let alone informal renters for migrant workers. I don't think anyone sitting in front of me has ever signed a registered rent agreement. How do you know who's renting? How do you know where they are? Okay. And importantly, if you have a security guard who's renting a room with 8 other guards in Indiranagar, it is likely that the person he's renting it from is equally a petty landlord who is not some cinematic character of a capitalist property owner. The landlord is just as vulnerable as the tenant. So I take my academic training, I go back to the data, and the data tells me that in the bottom 1/3 of India, in our cities, landlords are poorer than their tenants. And in fact, for single women widows, rent is often the primary source of income through which they go old. So it was not just about protecting the tenants, it was also about protecting the landlords. But the big question there was, no one had a database of landlords or tenants. I joined the government of Delhi's emergency hunger relief, working with the government to do state relief during the pandemic. The Delhi government said we will give cash transfers to workers to avoid wages. We had no database of waste workers, domestic workers, construction workers, no formal employment, no job contracts, no bank accounts to give them money. So the construction workers were registered, they got money twice. We could not find ways. This story is what in this book we call a knot, a kind of a puzzle that is so caught that it reminds you that no story is what it appears at first. That COVID was not a health pandemic, it was an economic pandemic as much as a health pandemic. And it had come after demonetization, it had come after GST, it had come after a series of shocks that don't show up in our GDP numbers and our stock indexes and in the number of people who fly in the domestic economy. Post-COVID, when we were told our economy was recovering, the four things we measured was automobile sales, domestic flights, the stock index, and savings. 7 of every 10 Indians have none of these four things. The story led us then, and the rest of us were thinking the same questions from Cape Town, from Durban, from London, from Shenzhen, from Cairo. And one of the things that made us realize is that there were a series of stories like this. Questions about cities had changed around us. I'll give you an example of 3. How do we grow without carbon? I was taught urbanization in my PhD as the urban as the engine of growth, of dynamism, of an economy. 200 years of industrial growth, all the cities we love, London, Paris, New York, Tokyo, grew with industrialization and colonization. How do you grow without industrialization? Right? What is an urbanization without industrialization? And if the carbon growth trajectory closes, what are cities meant to aspire to? How do we think of information and knowledge when knowledge is now not created, but it flows around us like air? This is what big data is. Right? Big data has changed the way academics think about knowledge. We don't collect primary information anymore. We actually sit within information that is throwing multiple patterns on us, but it tells us what, but it doesn't tell us why. How do we think about how those 8 of every 10 workers form unions? Because when we understood the logics of urban politics, of resistance, of fights, of social movements, our notion was strike, union, collective bargaining, wage. How do informal workers organize around unions? Who are the employer industry of domestic workers if each of them works in 5 different houses for 45 minutes a day? Each of these questions are questions to which the language in which we were taught to think has stopped working. So the reasons we came to this book were because of these 3 things. The first was the sense that a set of terms that we knew in our life, modernity, progress, growth, globalization, they had stopped making sense in the 24th century. Climate change had changed them. I'll give you another example. I was raised at a time where we were taught social and political thought by saying there is something called international human rights. There is something called international law. There is something called the United Nations. Post-World War II, the longest century of peace. What do I say about international law when genocide doesn't violate international law? Right? What do I think about? And it's not just a question of who is right, who is wrong. Part of what we're saying in the book is, how do you think about these things anymore? What words can you rely on? What does the word secular mean in India today? What does it hold? What does it signal? What does it make you feel? Not its dictionary definition. Do we have a language that thinks about that mile sur mera tumhara secularism that I grew up with? Right? What is the word? The word has been leached of its power. It no longer communicates the thing we thought it communicates, right? So words in my everyday life, right? South Korea just declared martial law for 6 hours. What does the word democracy mean when you have Bolsonaro and Erdogan and Putin and Trump and what does the word mean when we think about formations of the idea of democracy, right? And I think that in some ways, as academics, we were trained to say when your language is like sand slipping out of your hand, it is time to write. It is not time to write with certainty. It is time to write with some idea of courage to say what is the language in which to speak of the world. We can't speak of the entire world, but we know how to speak about cities. So we spoke about cities. The second thing was that when we thought of, go back to that knot. Right? When you think of a knot, it's very interesting. There are 4 pieces, and if any of you have worn a pajama where that Nana knot is stuck 1 inch to the right of the opening, you feel this moment. The problem is when you find that knot, you are always saying, should I pull this one or this one? And you know if you pull one, it will tighten the knot, and if you pull the other, it will open the knot. Honestly, academic thought is like this. We're always looking to see, do I pull the knot like this? Then will it unravel the story of COVID to me in a way that I can change the way I think? Or will I tighten and lose my understanding even further? One of the reasons why our knots are so complicated is because we have come to a world where our training as academics has become so deeply specialized, so siloed into disciplines, so narrow in our expertise, that we have forgotten to look at the entirety of the knot. We just look at our thread. We are either sociologists or engineers or designers or mathematicians or physicists, as if we have no language in which to speak to each other. But this is something I tell my students all the time. When you go to the city, it doesn't give a shit what your PhD was in. When you walk in a community that has no water connection, they don't care if you solve it as an anthropologist or as an engineer. Place doesn't care. The world doesn't care, right? We have to learn to talk across discipline. We have to follow questions regardless of whether we have the tools currently to think about them. But the thing is, the word interdisciplinary is lovely to say. No one disagrees with it. It's like the word secular, right? No one disagrees with secularism, yet we're losing it every single moment. Right? Interdisciplinarity is the same thing. So one of the things we wrote in this book was how to actually be interdisciplinary. How to follow puzzles and knots and questions and not worry if they're sociological or anthropological or physical. Right? To listen to cities in a different way, to see them in different way, to diagnose them in different way. I grew up in the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. My father was a doctor, and I would follow him around on ward rounds in the pediatric ward. And I would watch him look at a little, he was a pediatrician, to look at a little baby who could not speak to him and intuit what was happening. And I kept thinking that intuition is exactly what untangling a knot feels like. You don't know what information will come. Sometimes the baby is not even able to tell you what's wrong with it. But the body tells you one thing. The parents tell you one thing. The sound tells you one thing. The smell tells you one thing. How do we listen in different ways is another way to think about how we move across disciplines. And the last reason we wrote the book is something that had troubled the 4 of us a lot. The 4 of us are interesting co-writers. We're all formally trained researchers. We have all worked inside the state in policy. We have all fought the state in social movements. But principally, we are all 4 teachers. And one of the things that was very core to us in writing the book was to imagine what we hand to our students in 2024. And one of the things that was very important to us on that was saying, we have forgotten to ask not just what and how, we have forgotten to remind ourselves why it matters, the questions we ask. What is our stake in the ground? Why do we do what we do? So I ask my students all the time, why do you give a shit? What do you care about? technical rigor is not enough if it is not matched with a sense of empathy and values. And the danger in a lot of contemporary knowledge is particularly in the technical sciences. There is a sense that I do objective research and analysis. मेरे research में politics नहीं. There is no knowledge without politics. And politics is not a dirty word. Politics is values and ethics and morals and positions. And we were tired of scholarship that sat in an ivory academy pretending it was not a stake in the ground. We wanted scholars to say what you care about, say what you believe, right, left, middle, up, down, doesn't matter. But make your positions apparent. Say what you are fighting for. Okay? So that why was very important to us. So the end of the day, the book is about three very simple things: thinking, doing, and feeling. It is a book on how to think about cities. It is a book on how to do things in cities. And it is a book to bring back saying, in both thinking and doing, don't lose feeling. Don't lose that core sense of what motivates you. And because we're academics and we can't just say thinking, doing, and feeling, we called it the normative, the analytical, and the operation. Okay? So the normative, the idea of the norm of values, is what is your location? The analytical is the thinking. How do you think about something across disciplines? And the operational is don't raise knowledge for knowledge's sake. How do you translate knowledge into its doing? Right? And in our head, these dance around like a number line. How do you make sure you don't do without thinking? How do you make sure you don't think without doing? And how do you never forget the feeling that made you think or do in the first place? And this is why the term we have used in this is not a book with new urban theory. There's no new primary data. It is not about a particular sector. It's not a book on housing or on planning or on infrastructure. It is a book about an urban disposition. And that disposition word is a word I have grown to really love. Right? What is a disposition? It's a sensibility. It's a position. It's a nazariya. It's a way of looking. Right? And for us, the disposition is these three elements: the normative, the analytical, the operational, the thinking, feeling, doing. It's a simple book. It's 200 pages. The three chapters are called the normative, the analytical, and the operational. One of the things we say in the book is you can read it in any order you like, because you may be more interested in the operational, just go straight there. Unfortunately, books linearly do go from start to finish. But there's no reason. Remember when we were kids, we used to read those books saying, if you want the Hardy Boys to die, go to page 82. If you don't. So it's a bit like that. You can read it in any order you want, whether you're more moved by doing or thinking or feeling. But at some point, we say complete the loop. And to write a book like this about a disposition for us has felt the need to sort of say that sometimes at a time when language is failing, incomplete, the thing to do is to take a step back, step away from the thing you're looking at for a second, so that you can think. And one of my favorite philosophers, Michel Foucault, used to say, thinking begins when you make the familiar strange. You look at something that you have always looked at. You look at a building made of, to link to the previous session, you look at a building made of concrete, and you say, of course you make a building of concrete. What if you stare at that building long enough that concrete becomes a bizarre material to build with in the middle of climate change? Right? Generations will ask us later, how did you keep building in concrete? How did you build buildings in Delhi in glass? What were you thinking? We forgot to make the familiar strange. We forgot to step back, to let go of certainty so that there's room for new ways of thinking. I will say something about the tone. We think we've written a delightfully accessible book. But we're academics, so don't believe us fully. It is a deeply accessible academic book. I'm told that there is still some distance to cover before it becomes just an accessible book. And the book gave me something that I have been looking for a long time. Actually, it gave me permission to write the book I've been trying to write for 10 years, which is a book on my own work on inequality and social protection in cities, which now I only want to sell at the airport. and actually write a book that I don't have to even make academically accessible, but accessible. But I can tell you, some parts of it will feel like you've picked up an academic book, but I feel like it's not so taxing. So fair warning, but also encouragement if you'd like to pick it up. We did do one very nice thing. There are no citations or footnotes or theories that appear in the middle. All of them are shoved to the back at the end, only if you want them. And I think one of the things that's been really lovely for me is to be able to, at the end of the book in the operational chapter, one of the things we write about is, but how do you survive a life of doing? How do you survive a life of activism, of theory, of things that change very slowly? The thing about working with wicked problems is that the fights are long and the roads are long. So we wrote a lot also about the things we wish someone would have told us when we were younger. How to survive your first disappointments, how to lose your battles, how to work really hard on a policy that never sees the light of day, how to lose a battle against an eviction, how to win a court case against 377 over 15 years and not 5. All of these strange stories find their way in the book. But one thing we say is, you cannot do so unless you build communities of practice. And communities of practice to us are very particular things. They're different from communities of friendship. And those communities of practice are not easy to make, but they are the core of complexity and complex thinking. Sometimes I feel like we want to understand and unpack complexity, but still do it on our own. This collective action problem is as true of protecting Bangalore's lakes. It's as true of academic scholarship. It's as true of holding a union together. But the fact that the four of us managed to write a book collectively was us putting our money where our mouth is and showing we are each other's community of practice. And it's restored a lot of faith in me about the possibility of collective knowledge. And I'll stop there, and I hope you enjoy it. There are copies for sale across. I'll walk over, and thank you for spending half an hour with me on a Sunday afternoon. Okay, if anyone would like to ask a couple of questions, I'm happy to.
Hi, thank you so much for that. That was wonderful. One question that I have, and which I have asked myself also for a long time in consideration of the topic that you've discussed, in the world of capitalism, where all of us are just almost submerged or caught in the net, is there hope for change in the lines that you're talking about in interdisciplinary?
Can I take all of them together?
Hey, so thank you so much for this thing. It was really beautiful. But I was thinking about when you mentioned about collective writing, at a time when Indian public universities are being hijacked by the incumbent government, where professors are being placed and they subscribe to just one view. We see our universities being divided as ever, and where professors are divided. So how do you see that happening right now?
You want to take the last one?
My question's fairly elementary. It's just, what does a city like Bangalore need to think, feel, and do? What is your opinion on that? Yeah?
Okay, so capitalism. So, one of the things I think about when you think about something that is so large, is so paradigmatic, I would say the first thing to do is to do exactly this. Defamiliarize it. Don't give it an automatic sense that it has always been and will always be. Because the minute you concede to a structure's eternalness, then you only think of tinkering and repairing at the margins. You forget that actually it can shake. And think of how quickly things can shake. I'll give you two examples. I grew up as a queer person in India in the 1980s. If you had told me, with all its warts, that I could sit here as a queer person who was known for being an urbanist instead of being a queer person, I would not have believed. 14-year-old me would not have believed. 25-ish, I'm not telling my age, 25-ish odd years is not a long time. Think of Syria this morning. Right? Think of the Arab Spring. Think of the thing about change is that its ability to come structurally and fundamentally is actually its core strength and its most unsettling attribute. But what we have to refuse is to start talking about capitalism as an inevitable heir that can never be changed. Because if we don't do that unseating in our mind, we will stop focusing on which part of the knot do we pull. And the second, more practical answer to your question, I don't think anything has challenged capitalism more than climate. The logics of capitalism we have today is industrial and financial. Neither of them will survive climate. And it is the first time where I have seen, even in the heart of capitalism, questions of fundamental, this GDP is not enough, growth is not enough. My fear is that, like it happened in colonialism, Europe and North America and the global north will leave carbon and transition to slow growth, smart growth, compact cities, and we will not. Right? And it's a tough call for us because we cannot abandon or choose a model of sustainable development that keeps our carbon footprint low because a majority of our people lead poor lives. That is not acceptable. It is not acceptable for our sustainability to come at the cost of people's poverty. Right? So the questions, but there are fundamental questions being asked, and I think the Anthropocene will challenge capitalism at its DNA. And when that happens, you have to be right there ready with your axe. But for that, you have to imagine the axe and imagine the tree can be felled. Right? That's the one thing I'd say about it. The question of collective writing and the public university. So one of the things we have, I think this is an absolutely fundamental point. We are not writing at a place where knowledge is welcome. We are writing at a moment where knowledge is embattled. It is refused, it is denigrated. We have become defensive about our knowledge. Right? I think that, so one of the things that the book also sometimes reflects upon is exactly this. How do you write in a moment where what you're writing is not welcomed? But how do you not write in a way that your resistance becomes irrelevant? And that's a strategic question. One has to survive. I'm in conversation with Aruna Roy this afternoon, right? One of the things Aruna taught me in life is that your resistance has to be smart, right? And so the questions we have to ask today is, how do we resist in ways that take seriously the ways in which the public university is being decimated? And how do we resist in a way that our resistance and we will survive to see the other end of this? And collective writing in certain forms is absolutely part of that. And it may not come out of our academic presses yet. And it may be up to people like me who have the power to write a book and not care what the academy thinks. It may not be for the young assistant professor who's just starting. And that's also strategy. One has to know when you can fight a fight to survive it. Otherwise, it's martyrdom. And remember, one word for martyrdom is shahadat. But the word to be shaheed is not to be a martyr. The core Arabic etymology of shaheed is to bear witness. And to bear witness, you have to be around. And to be around, you have to fight smartly and for the long one. That's the way I would think about it. And for Bangalore, this is that you're asking a very tricky question to a Delhi transplant in Bangalore. Huh? So I will say this, I find Bangalore at a very, very fascinating moment where it is. It's very much like where Delhi was in the 2000s. There is a sudden expansion. The city has to deal with the fact that it's no longer a local. It now belongs to many more people than it did earlier. It's an uncomfortable realization. There is a moment in which some part of the city resists this growth. I think of it as an adolescence in some ways. You know, it's gangly, it's joyful, it's innocent, it's pure, it's also slightly self-involved and a bit bratty. And I think that all cities have to go through this. This transition, when you become a megacity, it changes who you are, and that change is not easy. I think my biggest question on particular things is that Bangalore has to actually have a slight mirror moment, and I say this with deep love for this city, to realize that the next phase of its life is not going to be like the one it was. And it can't only be seen as a sense of loss. The urban doesn't know loss. The urban only knows change. And I think it would be good for all of us here to think about that change. We'll hate some of it. We'll love some of it. but whatever it happens, the city belongs to no one. That's always been its promise. But there is a lot here, I believe, in the DNA of the city that can absorb it. And that's what Bangalore's Bangalore-ness is. It will find its way. Thank you very much, Shaka.